Autónoma in Bucaramanga. He has master degrees in national security and defense from Escuela Superior de Guerra.
Thank you.
He's also having a master in political and international studies from the Universidad del Rosario. He's a Spanish specialist in integration, and he gained this degree at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar. He also graduated from the Security and Defense course in the Caribbean islands, from the William J. Perry Center of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He was a fellow at the European Parliament in Brussels, and where he did the Democracy Fellowship program at the European Parliament. He is one of the main scholars at Instituto de Ciencia Política, which is a very, very prominent think tank here in Colombia. It's defending and advancing ideas of individual liberty and free markets, but it is also very well known in the country and respected. And the experts, including Augusto, are very often commenting in the mainstream media and changing the political climate of ideas in Colombia, which is so important because we need Colombia to be, forefront of freedom. Without further ado, Carlos Augusto Chacón.
Thank you, Jacek. And thank you, everyone, for come to Colombia and give us the opportunity to have this important conference in our country. I want to talk about a very important issue from my country for the reality of geopolitical situation in our region. I would like to extend my warmest greetings to all of you. I'm honored to be here today at this edition of the International Liberty World Conference. Today, I would like to share with you some reflections on the importance of economic freedom expressed through the entrepreneurial function in an economic system governed by the criteria of dynamic efficiency for peace building, peacekeeping, and for nation building, and as a legitimate and effective means to face fourth-generation conflicts. And I need a little help, Maria Alejandra. When Maria Alejandra or Hernando, someone in Colombia, please let me know when I am in the just time, because I used to speak a lot. With this in mind, I will try to point out how the entrepreneurial function has been not only the missing link, but the link that has been denied by different state and non-state actors in the territories historically affected by violence and criminality. At the same time, I will show how some territories have undergone positive transformations when the entrepreneurial function, overcoming governmental restrictions and violent repression by different illegal actors, succeeds at generating development and contributing to the construction of safe, less violent environments with higher levels of development and prosperity. We will use two frameworks of analysis, a theoretical conceptual one and an empirical one based on the work we have been developing at the Instituto de Ciencia Política Hernán Echavarría Olózaga. At the conceptual theoretical level, I want to frame the topic in the light of the fourth-generation conflicts, using for this purpose the so-called Manwaring paradigm, also known as the SWORD model, Small Wars Operation Research Directorate, developed by Professor Max Manwaring, and the central elements of the dynamic efficiency theory of Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto to explain how the entrepreneurial function in a dynamic economic system drives creativity and entrepreneurial coordination. Why it is important to understand fourth-generation conflicts? Because in order to design efficient and effective responses to overcome the condition of violence and coercion imposed in a context of criminal dynamics involving different actors, it is essential to understand the nature of war, conflicts, and threats faced. Fourth-generation conflicts are characterized by the fact that the center of gravity is no longer territorial control, but the public opinion and the legitimacy of the regime to exercise the monopoly of violence, impose the law, and exercise its basic functions of security and justice. The battlefield is society as a whole, including institutions and culture, where the state has lost its monopoly of violence and narrative to non-state actors and third states with geopolitical interests responsible for promoting or supporting violence with a view to generating instability, chaos, and in some cases, terrorism. There is a shift from a paradigm of conventional warfare between military forces with similar or symmetrical warfare capabilities to a population-oriented model through the use of asymmetrical means with multidimensional and offensive characteristics, in addition to the defensive ones, to achieve the most important objective in fourth-generation warfare, to ideologically influence the population to undermine its degree of adherence and support for the government. In this context, it is important to keep in mind that on a more sophisticated information and technology level, contemporary conflicts includes, but is not restricted to financial war, trade war, economic warfare, media war, cyber war, chemical and biological war, nuclear war, net war, and bond relationship targeting. It is clear that war against the economic model is an integral part of the enemy's action in an asymmetrical conflict. Professor Manguari of the U.S. Army War College designed the SWORD model, which allows outlining a strong and coherent conceptual framework or a set of principles from which doctrine, strategy, and tactics can flow and thereby improve the prospects for success in future counterinsurgency efforts. It can also serve as secondary but valuable purpose as a guide for historical analysis. The model comprises 7 dimensions to measure the effectiveness of any government's counterinsurgency effort: legitimacy, unity of effort, military capability, internal and external isolation, information, intelligence, and external military support. In accordance with these dimensions, Professor Manguari elaborated a paper called Translating Lessons Learned in Colombia and Another Wars Among the People Confronting the Spectrum of 21st Century Conflict, in which he highlights the lesson of the Colombian case, among others, that the real ultimate threat is the failure of the state, that the insurgency war in Colombia, one can see a variety of politically-oriented, violent, and terroristic non-state actors perpetrating a level of human horror, violence, criminality, corruption, and internal disequilibrium that threaten Colombian survival as a democratic nation state. This characterization or description is complemented with the political strategic appreciation regarding to the threat posed by the asymmetric war doctrine implemented in Venezuela since Hugo Chavez came to power through what he called the new strategic map. Chavez presented this document and said, "I call on everyone to initiate an effort to understand the ideas, concepts, and doctrine of asymmetric warfare." As noted in a report written by Joseph Humire from the Center for a Security-Free Society, the Venezuelan regime has prepared for decades for this exact moment, when the Colombian state arrived weakest. And they have an asymmetric strategy to use illicit network as a 21st century vanguard to conquer more territory of its neighbor. But first, the Bolivarian revolution needs to capitalize on the current unrest in Colombia by amplifying disinformation and misinformation that cause confusion and sow social division with Colombian society. In order to understand how the free market constitutes the pillar of guaranteeing security in the face of the challenge of contemporary conflicts, especially those arising from the asymmetric and hybrid threats, it is necessary to establish a framework of analysis which in this particular case is based on the dynamic conception of the market processes, based on the theory of the entrepreneurial function and the concept of dynamic efficiency developed by Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto. To understand this relationship, it can be considered that the most outstanding aspects of the entrepreneurial function are going to be propitiated by the dynamic criteria of efficiency, and that in complementary way it can be stated that an economic system is so much more efficient the more and the better it drives creativity and entrepreneurial coordination. Such creativity and coordination can be hindered by non-state actors using violent means for economic and social control, as well as by the state using coercion and the intervention in the economy through planning and regulation to control the market. Both actors can also coincide in implementing violent actions to impose the criterion of distributive or redistributive justice, which could be considered to constitute the ethical foundation of important political and social movements of a socialist or social democratic nature that has its origin or foundation in the static conception of economic efficiency. This, of course, ignoring and violating the axiomatic character of the principle that every human being has the right to appropriate the results of his entrepreneurial creativity. Therefore, respect for private property rights and economic freedom constitute an ethical framework that makes dynamic efficiency possible in such a way that a human being, a company, an institution, or an entire economical system will be all the more efficient the more and the better they promote entrepreneurial function. Of course, an open and peaceful society is incompatible with individual or political practices that use violence, coercion, fraud, to take things that do not belong to them and that others have legally produced or acquired. An institutional framework that favors economic freedom aims to recognize how social attitudes are strengthened when individuals can participate in the market process without interference, being able to create, innovate, produce, sell, consume, and invest to try to satisfy their preferences in a system characterized by dynamism, voluntariness, competition, and exchange. As recognized by the Fraser Institute in the Economic Freedom Index, this theoretical conceptual framework presented above is articulated with an empirical framework developed from the work that we in the ICP, as the think tank, have been developing in the last 2 years, especially from 3 activities which we have influenced various decision makers and public opinion. First, our public policy laboratory, security and strategy ICP policy lab. Second, the report we present to the Through Commission on the victims of the armed conflict due to their involvement in the productive sector. Third, the result for Colombia of the Economic Freedom Index of the Fraser Institute of Canada, which we presented in the first half of the year to the government and the Congress, and the audit we are conducting, the result of which we will present at the end of this year. In addition, the results of the indexes to which we contribute, such as the International Property Rights Index and the Legatum Prosperity Index. From the ICP Policy Lab, we have been able to explain to public opinion and decision makers how the violent protests are framed in the 4th generation war that we face at the current juncture and the complexity of asymmetric and hybrid threats represented by the convergence of internal and external criminal networks, be they those operating on both sides on the Colombia and Venezuela borders, such as the National Liberation Army, ELN, or the so-called FARC dissidents. as well as those of a transnational nature, such as Hezbollah. These criminal structures act to achieve their own political and strategy ends related to the control of a value and supply chains of illegal economies and the consolidation of centers of criminal power, especially at the local and rural level, where they can control drug trafficking and illegal mining, while serving as a proxy for the interests of third states, such as Venezuela and its international allies, Iran, Russia, China, and Turkey. You can see in the last years, more than 2 decades, the dynamics of these groups are the same. The ELN now is more strongest than 10 years ago, and the so-called FARC dissidences maintain the control of various parts of the country, in different regions, especially in the border with Venezuela. The report of the victims of the productive sector is an unprecedented document in the framework of the true commissions implemented worldwide as a part of the transnational justice system. And through it, we seek to counteract the dominant and almost hegemonic narrative that in Colombia seeks to assign responsibility for the armed conflict to the economic model and businessmen. In keeping with the Marxist-Leninist nature of the Colombian guerrillas, their political and military project and the center of their strategy has been the destruction or radical transformation of the state, which they refer to as an oligarchy and which they consider to be their enemy. This includes the political and institutional structure as well as the economic, production, and private property model. The FARC have shown to know how to systematically exploit the civilian economy of the legal and illegal bonanza zones in exchange for the offer of protection with the respect to their own threat and that of the other armed groups, while generating the incentives to legal business function in order to consolidate criminal power centers that will allow them to control the illegal economies and therefore the sources of income and employment of the population under their control. In the framework of the negotiations in Havana, the negotiating members of the FARC-EP affirmed that, yes, the victims are victims of the conflict, and the state is the ultimate responsible by action or omission. The victims are not those of armed confrontation or the errors of war. Economic and social policy are the worst victimizers because they have caused the majority of deaths in Colombia by denying fundamental human rights such as the right to a dignified life, to food, to employment, to education, to housing, to health, to land, to political participation, and to good living when there is sufficient natural wealth to solve our social problems. The FARC-EP seeks to position a narrative that assigns responsibility to the state, the economic model, and its main agents, businessmen and traders. For this reason, in the ICP report, we draw the attention to two elements that are transversal. First, the different technologies of violence and criminal war tactics have sought to extract illicit rents from people who carry out productive activities while discouraging and affecting legal economy activities. Second, the need to combat the ideological bias of different actors whose narratives on the role and responsibilities of the productive sector seek to justify the political violence and the criminal actions of certain groups while ignoring the damages suffered by businessmen at the hands of all illegal groups. In addition, the report highlights the way in which the business function is at the same time a social function that contributes to peace building, generating opportunities where the state has never reached, so that many can leave the coca crops and free themselves from the subjugation of the criminal groups that control them, find them possibilities to develop dignified jobs with guarantees, which allows at the same time promoting a culture of legality and encouraging a culture of entrepreneurship. The testimonies gathered in the report show that violence and criminality continue in various regions of the country and that criminal groups continue to attack the productive sector. Organized violence intensified its action in the last 4 years. For the second semester of 2020, the action of criminals increased by 65% in the force since the signing of the agreement between the Santos government and the FARC-EP. By that year, approximately 38% of the armed actions were carried out by the ELN and another 34% by the so-called FARC dissidents. On the other hand, the empirical framework is nourished by our work with different think tanks to measure economic freedom, private property rights, and prosperity. It allowed us to evidence how dynamic efficiency and entrepreneurial function are hindered by the state. Considering that you understand very well the concepts that are measured in the most of these indexes, I allow myself to summarize the results as follows. First, according to the Economic Freedom Index 2021, Colombia ranks below average. It currently ranks 92nd out of 162 countries. By subcategories, it ranks 808th in private property rights, 809th globally in commercial freedom, and 810th in labor regulations. Thank you, Justina. Thank you so much. International Property Rights Index 2020, Colombia ranks 62 out of 129 countries. And according to the Legatum Prosperity Index 2020, Colombia ranks 74th out of 165 countries. I try to go faster. There is an urgent, with these results, it's evident that there is an urgent need to guarantee the protection of property rights, especially those related to land tenure, particularly through the guaranteeing of land titles. For more than 5 decades, Colombia has faced a 4th-generation war or a low-intensity asymmetric conflict. The way in which the state has intervened to seek a solution can be summarized in 2 ways. On the one hand, through the dialogue and peace agreements with the different groups, be the insurgents or the so-called paramilitaries, in which the state has handed over political power in exchange for supposedly retaking territorial control. On the other hand, the implementation of military actions to control and confront these illegal armed groups using all means to combat them through military forces, intelligence, authorities, and justice. In this context, despite the temporary military achievements obtained between 2002 and 2010, the insurgent groups have achieved political recognition, while various structures known as dissidents continue to use arms illegally. Both approaches have been insufficient. According to the 2021 Global Peace Index, prepared by the Institute of Economic and Peace, Colombia ranks 144 out of 163 countries. In other words, in the last 11 years, the country has only improved 6 positions. As Manwaring points out in his analysis of the lesson of the Colombian case, it is recommended that a concerted educational and organizational effort to help develop a new paradigm for conventional and unconventional operations, military and civilian leaders will sooner or later have to confront hybrid, decentralized, and networked threats and led operation across the full spectrum of the 21st century. For this reason, we propose that the new paradigm for peace building in a context of fourth-generation warfare and hybrid and asymmetric threats should incorporate actions to make it possible to generate an environment for the effective exercise of economic freedom and the respect for private property rights, so that the economic system can achieve the dynamic efficiency that facilitates the entrepreneurial function, so that through this they can consolidate economic and social dynamics in the territories historically affected by violence and criminality, and develop containment and deterrence capabilities against third countries that use asymmetric means to generate instability. The virtues of economic freedom are not only reflected in economic growth and per capita income, but also contribute to create an open society where citizen attitudes such as a social trust, tolerance, and coexistence perform better. This even allows us to think that the commitment to greater economic freedom can become an integral and efficient policy to overcome the problems of insecurity and violence. As we evidence in the ICP, it has occurred in municipalities highly impacted by violence, such as Tumaco in the Colombian Pacific and Mapiripan, Meta in the east of the country. In our report of the Through Commission, we show how companies, when they can operate in those territories, contribute to the construction of peace. A free and peaceful society is possible if companies are allowed to develop their activities and have the positive impact on social transformations. In this purpose, we seek to promote a peace building by exploring what possible types of order and institutional arrangements we do not pass through the authority of a centralized and absolute state, and which in fact are already presented in our reality, could serve as a starting point to a new institutionality, constituted by a minimal but legitimate state. This can be reinforced by the recognition that the system of private enterprise and the market is a system that can give the population freedom with prosperity, as professed by Hernán Echavarría Olózaga, founder of the Institute of Political Science. Thank you so much.